And thank you, Josh, Steve, and Joel. And I miss hearing those guys. You guys get to hear them every weekend. And I can't tell you how spoiled you are. I mean, they just, awesome job, phenomenal job. I guess my only question about your prayer, Daryl, is that you mentioned we're only going to be here for about 40 minutes, and I plan on speaking for at least about 90. So if you guys are okay, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to do that to you, I promise. Well, thank you guys so much for coming out this morning. As you can tell, I'm not Robert. I'm sorry you're kind of stuck with me this weekend. He'll be back next weekend. And he asked me to fill in today. And I'm always honored by the opportunity to come up here and share with you what I believe that God's been telling me. And, I got to be honest. This takes a lot out of me because I believe that you guys deserve the best. And oftentimes I don't think that I'm the guy that can deliver that. So in preparation for weeks when I have the opportunity to communicate, I put in a lot of effort and I try and read at least a couple of books because I want you guys to come back and I want you to experience God in a way that you never have before. And so as I was sharing this burden with Robert a couple of weeks ago and he and I got together, he told me about the dream that he had had. And I'm sure that you all heard him a few weeks ago when God woke him up in the middle of the night and he gave him a message, which was to cease striving. That it's not all up to you. That he's going to show up and that this is going to be a powerful experience for you. And I thought that was so incredible. And that's what we're going to talk about today, among other things. Because I really believe that God's been teaching me that, to cease striving over this next calendar year. But it doesn't happen by accident. It's got to be intentional. So this morning, I'm going to ask you all a series of questions. And I hope that I'm going to dive into your life in a pretty significant and deep way. Because I want you to walk out of here unsettled. I want you to walk out of here uncomfortable. I want you to come back. But I want you to question where you're going over this next year. Because I don't want you to get wrapped up in the busyness of life and miss what God has for you. So, with that, Michelle, if you would. Have you guys ever been forced to slow down? Speaking of ceasing striving, I was forced to slow down in 2004. At the time, I was living in Southwest Florida in Fort Myers, and we've all experienced this, whether it's been a snow day or whether you all have experienced a hurricane. And I hope that you haven't, because it's one of the worst things you can experience. But Hurricane Charlie was coming through this was August 13th of 2004. And I'm not sure if you guys had seen this on the news, but as you can tell from the path of the green arrows, it kind of came in and it was a little discombobulated. It wasn't a really organized storm. And it came off the coast of Key West, and it was projected, if you look at those green arrows, to hit Tampa. And so myself and three of my buddies, my buddy had just built a house in Fort Myers, which is where the red arrow is. And he said, Chris, why don't you come over? We're going to have a hurricane party. I said, great. I've never been through a hurricane. Let's grab some beer and let's just, wait for the storm to come. And really stupid, by the way. And so we're watching the news, and all the storms are projecting to go north. This whole thing is supposed to hit Tampa. And all of a sudden, the eye starts to wobble. And this is all new to me. I've never been in a hurricane. And when that happens, it's really bad because it just gets very unpredictable where it's going to make its landfall. So it made a 90-degree turn, and it hit Fort Myers head on. And so we're watching the news. All of a sudden, the lights turn out, the electricity's off, and the wind comes. And for 4 hours, it was 150 mile an hour sustained wind. We saw gusts 10 miles north of us of 193 miles an hour. And his house was built to withstand 175 miles an hour. So the walls started to breathe. And it was absolutely terrifying. So if you would flip to the next slide, Michelle. This is where it hit. And if you can see where the red dot is, that's where I was with my three buddies. And so here we are, 4 guys, thinking we're pretty tough. Nobody drank a beer because we were absolutely terrified. And what went from going to be a great time turned into something really terrifying. We found ourselves in the hallway with the mattresses on tops of our heads because that's what the news guy told us to do. And if you would flip to the next slide. And this was some of the pictures of the devastation. So for the next 9 days in Southwest Florida, the entire city shut down. This Category 4 storm, if I could just read you some of the stats here, peaked out at gusts at 193 miles an hour, like I mentioned. There was a total sustained damage of over $13 billion in the state of Florida. 10 people lost their life. And so for the next 9 days, the whole city was under martial law, which basically means you sit on your porch with a rifle, honestly. And it was really terrifying. But I found myself not having anything to do. I mean, what do you do when you can't go to work? There's no gas in the gas stations. You can't go to the grocery store. And you've all experienced this maybe with a snowstorm. And so you get these times in your life where you're forced to slow down. And I want to know how that made you feel. What'd you do during that time? And what did it look like? Because oftentimes, if it's not the weather, it can be a tragedy that makes you slow down. Michelle, if you would flip to the next slide. After the storm, this is what I came out to. I walked out of my buddy's house, came out to his backyard, and I was new to all of this. I just started going to church, and I don't know if you all have ever experienced this before, and I really hope that you have. But sometimes in life, you find yourself reciting scripture, but you don't even remember reading it. And it just happens. It just pops into your head, and you know it verbatim. So I walked to the edge of my buddy's property, and I'm looking up at the sky, and I'm just thanking God that we were okay. There was a boat in his front yard. There was a basketball hoop in his backyard, and we're walking through this rubble, and I'm out there by myself, and I stand up and I look up, and that's the scene that I saw. All the clouds had broken and the sun was coming through, and it really was this ethereal experience. And I heard just a quiet voice in the back of my mind, not audibly, but I heard this verse, "Be still and know that I am God," from Psalm 46. And there was such an emphasis on be still and know that I am God. And I can't tell you what it felt like to be in that experience. It was so powerfully overwhelming because I had just seen what he's capable of. So, if you would, flip to the next slide. This morning, we're going to talk about intentionally slowing down. Because I want you all to look at this next year of 2015. Now that we're in the month of January and this is our goal-setting month for the year, everybody's ramping up. By the way, how's everybody doing on their goals? I'm not doing that well. And I think it's for this reason. I want you guys to walk out of here today thinking about what's going to happen in 2015. How are you going to intentionally slow down? Because if you don't hear me say anything else today, hear me say this. God doesn't show up in the busyness unless it's a crisis. And we all know that. That he calls us to live a life of margin. And if I can, I'm going to define margin for you. Margin is that difference between your current performance and your breaking point, your absolute limits. And we all know, if you would flip to the next slide, Michelle, we can't live like this. You can't live at your current performance right at the point of your limits, at your current breaking point. But that's what we do. And we all know it. You probably came into here running late. I'm late to church almost every weekend. I'm ashamed to say it. I'm late to work all the time. I feel like my life is just running from one appointment to the next to the next. Because I don't have that degree of margin. So I'm going to ask you all a series of questions today as we dive into this theory. Because I don't want you to live your life like I'm currently going through it. Because I really believe that God's been teaching me the value of this lesson. And I don't want to wait for a crisis in my life to be forced to slow down. But it doesn't come without intentionality. To live a life with margin, it comes with accurately reviewing and re-examining how you're currently going and what your pace looks like. So you all know what margin looks like on the freeway. It's the space between you and the car next to you. It's that safety zone. You don't want to get too close because it's too dangerous. But what does it look like in your personal life? So those are some of the things we're going to talk about. Specifically, it's showing up to an appointment early and having 10 or 15 minutes just to relax. When's the last time that happened? It's having money left over at the end of the month. Usually it's the other way around. You've got more month than you have money at the end of the month. It's experiencing an argument with somebody you love and care about, maybe it's your spouse, and not losing your temper. There's something in us that needs margin. There's something in us that cries out that we need a degree of margin in our life. And we all know it to be true, but I want to talk about where that comes from, because I believe it's from God. I believe that God is intentionally calling us to have a balance in our life and to be more intentional about establishing this principle. So here are some of the ways and the areas of margin and how it's broken down. With our time and our schedules, I'm just going to ask you all a couple of questions. To my students in the room, high school students, think about last year. How many extracurricular activities were you involved in? How many sports were you running to from practice to practice? Did you turn in those assignments late on time? Were you exhausted when you got to class the next day? To my parents in the room, did you feel like a chauffeur as you were running your kids from extracurricular activity to extracurricular activity? When's the last time you did something for yourself? Why do we choose to live like this? Michelle, if you would, flip to the next slide. Does your schedule look like this? Pretty slammed, week in and week out, month after month. Do you want that to stop? Well, we're going to talk about that. How many commitments did you all have last year where you said yes and you wish you would have said no? Why don't we do that? Next slide, if you would. This is my favorite slide. This is my little boy, Jack. 19 months old, full of life, as you can see, loves to drive Dad's tractor. I can't get enough of him. But as I look at my professional life, because I don't do this week in and week out, I work in academic medicine and I manage 2 departments at the Brown Cancer Center downtown. And as you can imagine, working with physicians day in and day out, it's a very cumbersome schedule. They need a lot. And I'm more than willing to give it to them. But you know, one thing I've realized about that occupation, as well as any occupation that everyone has in this room, you're going to cheat someone when it comes to your family. And you have to choose who you're going to cheat. You're either going to cheat your employer out of time with them, or you're going to cheat your family out of time with them. And we all know, because we've all seen this, and I've experienced this several times if I've done services at funerals. I've never heard someone say, I wish I would have spent another day at the office. No one says that. They always say, I wish I had more time with my kids. I wish I would have spent more time with my kids. So, professionally, how many times did you stay late last year? How often did you find yourself exhausted at work? Did you meet that deadline, or were you past it? When's the last time you actually felt on top of your tasks at work? Let's dive into this a little bit deeper. If you would go to the next slide. Financially, this one's not fun. No one likes this. But you all are really glad you came to church this morning, aren't you? Financially, how'd you do on your budget? Did you budge on your budget last year? My wife and I did. We didn't make our goals. Doesn't feel good, does it? Are you carrying debt? Did you want to tackle it last year and you didn't get the opportunity? Why is that? Why do we do that? Why do we buy houses we can't afford, drive cars that we can't make the payments on, and force ourselves to live without any financial margin? If you would, flip to the next slide. This one's real tough. To my young adults in the room, you all that are in dating relationships, wondering if you want to end up marrying the person that you're with, how are you doing physically in your relationship? Is that guy pushing you a little too far? Is he pushing you morally? Why do you let him do that? What does that look like? To my adults in the room, as you review this last year, what did your nightlife look like? Did you come home from work, maybe have a couple drinks, but not too much, but more than what you were comfortable with? Why do we do that? Let's go real deep. To my men in the room, think about last year. What does your internet search history say about you? Did you visit some sites you know you probably shouldn't have? Maybe they weren't that bad, but something you're not comfortable with. Why do we consistently live in this area of pushing ourselves to the moral boundaries that we know we're not comfortable with? We live right up to the line, hoping that we're not going to go over the edge until it's too late, until something happens, until you get caught. And no one wants to be there. So today, as we talk about margin, I want to argue that what's at stake is not your progress. It's your peace. So when Robert and I were talking about the whole principle of ceasing striving, this is something that God has been teaching me. That my progress at work, my progress in my finances, my progress with spending time with my family, or making sure that morally I'm doing the right thing, isn't at stake. It's my peace in those areas of my life. We all know this to be true. Your happiness cannot be measured by your prosperity or your progress. It's only measured by the quality of your relationships. So why? Why do we do this? Why do we live at the absolute breaking point? As I mentioned earlier, why don't we just sell our homes, buy smaller ones? Why don't we purchase cars that we can afford? Why don't we get out of those unhealthy relationships that we know we shouldn't be in the first place? And why? Why do we overcommit and exhaust ourselves day in and day out, week after week, only to crash every time that we hit the bed? Here's what I've discovered in my own life, and maybe this is true for you, and I hope that it is, because God's word tells exactly the opposite. The reason why I choose to live this way, the reason why I choose to live without any margin, is because I'm scared. If I can be real honest with you guys, I'm scared. I'm scared that I'm missing out. I'm scared that my friends are going to have more stuff than I am. And so I'm trying to keep up with them. I'm trying to meet expectations of others. And it's a rolling horizon. And in today's world, with information as fast as it is, and the awareness that we have of social media day in and day out, where everybody's picture and everybody's post looks like life is amazing and they have no problems, we all know it's not true. But it drives this insatiable ability that we're never going to measure up, that you're going to miss out on something. And the reality is, we all know that's a lie. We all know it's not true. But we live in a culture that pushes and pushes and pushes, and somehow awards us if we're consistently busy. It's an award if you're exhausted all the time. Think about this. When's the last time you took a day off from work and you came back in and somebody asked you how you spent your day off? How do we answer those questions? Well, I cleaned the garage and I did my taxes and I did this and I did that. I mean, it's a laundry list of what we did and what we accomplished on our day off, on the day when we're not supposed to be doing anything. I think that's part of the culture that we live in. And it's exhausting. And it's not part of God's design, as we're going to see. So what's the other lie? This kind of hits home with the men in the room. The other lie that I've discovered and that I've thought a lot about is that you're not going to matter. That you're not going to make a difference. If you're like me, you want to accomplish, you want to achieve. And so you have to fight that lie day in and day out. Because if you don't stay busy, then you're not working hard enough. If you're not exhausted all the time, if you don't have a million emails, if you don't have the fastest and the newest and the brightest and the smartest, if your kids aren't involved in every single extracurricular activity as all your friends' kids are, you're missing out. You're not going to matter. If you would, flip to the next slide. That's what I want to talk about today. God is calling us to rest and to re-examine. Specifically, let's look at this passage together in Genesis chapter 2, verses 1. We all know this passage. Everyone's familiar with it. So the creation of the heavens and the earth and everything in them was completed. God finished his job. On the seventh day, he rested from all of his work. And God blessed the Sabbath day and declared it holy, because it was a day when he rested from all of his work. You've heard that a million times. But how often do you do that? When's the last time you guys truly rested one day a week? You could look back on your work and say that it was good. I don't do that. And I want to start doing it this year. It's part of the way that God designed us. If we could, flip to the next slide. Here's another one. A call to rest and re-examine. In Exodus chapter 20, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. He gets real specific here. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath, and that's to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. Neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor any male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that's in them. But he rested on the seventh. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and he made it holy. I hope you can see this pattern this morning between these two passages. God recognized that every week, there's got to be one day where you rest. We all know this. Everyone knows this. Everyone's heard this. And when it comes to the other commandments and the other things that God has taught us, we can all say those things are wrong. We all know they're wrong. Cheating on your spouse, or coveting your neighbor's goods. Those things are easy to understand and to say, no, I absolutely wouldn't do that. I'm not going to go out and commit adultery or murder somebody. But when it comes to this commandment, we kind of gloss over it. And how do we answer it? If you're like me, you answer it with, well, you know what, God? I've got too much going on. I can't rest today. I've got homework. I've got to go to work. I've got to work on that project. And I think that goes directly against the way that he designed us to live. So, what does this look like practically? What does this application look like? If you all are running in 2015 like I am, you've got all these goals from the month of January that you're probably not meeting like I am, what does it look like to intentionally slow down and create margin in your life? Well, I read this phenomenal book in preparation for today, and I hope it's helpful to you. If you would, Michelle, flip to the next slide. There was a researcher that came out, and he said that 45% of our daily activities are habitual. Almost half your day is broken down into habits. And it's an unconscious activity that you all go through day in and day out, just like I do. Think about it this way. Do you remember when you drove to work on Friday morning? Do you remember what happened in the car? Probably not. The researchers suggest that neurologically, your brain is designed to conserve energy. So it's always trying to find ways to develop a pattern and intentionally turn off. So it creates habits. And he basically breaks down this cycle. And he says, with every habit, there's a cue. There's an activity. It's an impulse that sets you off into a behavior. And you get engaged in that behavior because you're pursuing a reward, something that makes you feel good. And it's a cycle, day in and day out. So I want to challenge you guys today to think about your habits as we go into this year. I want you to think about what you want to stop and how you want to stop it. So the researcher goes further on in the book. Great book, by the way. It's called The Power of Habit, if anybody wants to read it. And he said, in order to break this cycle, you have to recognize your cues. You have to recognize those impulses that make you want to engage in that behavior that you know is unhealthy. So he says it this way. The next time you find yourself saying, I don't know why I do this, but I just do it. I wish I could stop, fill in the blank. Recognize what happens at the beginning of that activity. So let me break this down and make it a little more applicable. Let's say that you come home from work every night and you want to stop sitting in front of the TV and vegging out like a zombie. And instead you want to engage your family. But you're exhausted. You're tired at the end of the day. So this researcher suggests that think about what happens when you get home from work. You walk in the door, you probably set down your briefcase or whatever you've had with you for the day, and then you engage in this behavior, and it's automatic. He said the first thing that you need to identify is the reward. Think about what you're going to be rewarded with after you change this behavior. He said begin with the end in mind. So basically, if I'm wanting to change this behavior when I come home from work, I want to spend more time with that little guy that I showed you earlier, I need to reward myself so that behavior changes, so that I don't just go to the TV and just hang out there. So what I do, because I want to relax, but I want to enjoy him, is I go for a walk. I'm going to try and engage in this new activity. And the reward is the opportunity to spend time with him. And hopefully, the joy that the two of us experience throughout that. But I've got to think about the reward in mind so that my behavior changes. If you would, flip to the next slide, Michelle. He goes on to say that your cues fall into one of 5 categories. It's either the time of day, a particular place, a particular person, a certain emotion, or a preceding behavior. So for instance, time of day. When I'm thinking about what sets off that behavior that I want to stop, I tend to overeat when I get home from work. I reach for something quick, salty or sweet. It's a particular place. I always overspend when I go to this particular store. My wife and I always overspend every time we go to Costco. It's a person. Whenever I hang out with my buddy Fred, we end up drinking too much. Fred is my cue for having too many drinks. I've got buddies like that. It's a certain emotion. When I feel stressed, if it's an argument or if it's at work, I go for something sweet. I go after those cookies. Or it's a preceding behavior, a ritual. And this may necessarily not be a bad thing, but you always grab a cup of coffee before you go into that meeting. So this researcher breaks down these cues, hoping that you can identify them and begin to just re-examine as we go into this next year, which is my hope, because this was helpful to me, as to how I'm going to reprioritize. You know, as Robert asks me to fill in for him on these weekends, it's exhausting for me. And I'll tell you why. As I mentioned earlier, I'm working full-time. I'm also going to school full-time. And I have a family to support. And I want to engage with them night after night. So I'm a lot like you guys. We're pulled in every single direction. And when Robert asks me to share, I want to make sure that what I'm sharing with you is authentic, but specifically what I believe that God has been teaching me. And I really believe that he's been hammering this principle with me over the last several months. Chris, you need to slow down. You need to re-examine, and you need to rest. You need to begin to learn the art of ceasing striving. You need to begin to create more margin in your life. And so although this process for me, in terms of preparing for this morning, is exhaustive, this drives me into a greater intimacy with God. So I carve out time for it. It's important because I know that I'm drawing closer to him as a result. And it's also a very revealing process because I'm completely vulnerable with you guys. And I want to be that transparent. Josh, you can come back up if you'd like. So as we begin to close down this morning, as I promised I wouldn't talk for 90 minutes, I want you guys to imagine with me, if you would. Imagine what this next year would look like with more margin. Imagine what this next year would look like in your life with a little more wiggle room in your finances, with more time to spend with the people that you love the most. Imagine what it would look like at work if you're not running from appointment to appointment. What does that look like? Most importantly, imagine what could happen in your relationship with the Lord. What's 2015 going to look like with your relationship with God? Because I can tell you, and we all know this to be true, the enemy of intimacy is busyness. The absolute enemy of intimacy is busyness. And it's the same in our relationship with God. We all know that to be true. And I want more than anything else for you guys to be changed this next year. And I hope you do too. If you would, Michelle, flip to the final slide. God's going to wait. We all know that. He'll wait to be invited back into your life. And that may come through a crisis. And I pray that it doesn't for you. He'll wait to be invited back in at a hospital bedside when you haven't taken care of your health and your family surrounding you. He'll wait until a bankruptcy or a foreclosure. He'll wait to be invited back in if there's a divorce. Last one, Michelle. You don't want to be the same Christian that you were last year, do you? I don't. I want to be so much closer to Him this next year than I was last year. But it doesn't come without intention. And it doesn't come without carving out time for Him. I hope this next year that you guys begin to experience what we read about in Scripture, where God speaks through that quiet intuition, that still small voice, that you know that something amazing just happened. And we believe that here at this church. We believe that God can speak into your life in a real way. So as we close, that's what I'm going to pray for. I'm going to pray for you guys specifically for that. Thank you so much for the opportunity to come here today. It means the world to me when I get the chance to do this, because I learn so much about myself. When I hope that you've learned something today too.